Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep, into the world of Leo Strauss.
Deep into Strauss.
Yeah. Now, for a philosopher like you, he's got to be like a familiar name, right? 20th century German Jewish emigre lands in the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
And really shakes up political philosophy. And what's wild is, like, the scope of his thinking. I mean, we're talking ancient Greece, Plato, all the way to, like, medieval thinkers, Maimonides, big names. Then he jumps right into modern guys, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Spinoza, even Nietzsche.
Yeah, that's Strauss.
He covers a lot of ground, doesn't he?
He does. And the thing is, he's not just like a historian, right? He's doing philosophy all the way through. Like, he said this really interesting thing once.
Yeah.
He said, there is no inquiry into the history of philosophy that is not at the same time a philosophical inquiry. So for you, thinking about these historical figures, it's not just about what they thought way back when.
Right.
It's about how their ideas, their problems are still alive, still relevant to what we're wrestling with today.
Totally. And that gets to the heart of what Strauss was trying to do, right? Like, what were the big questions that he was obsessed with?
Exactly.
Well, he was really concerned with, like, the foundations of political and moral norms, especially in the modern world. How do we know what's right and wrong? How do we justify those values?
Right.
And he felt like modern philosophy, with all its emphasis on reason and, being self-sufficient.
Yeah.
Maybe it missed something. Maybe the pre-modern guys had some insights that we kind of lost along the way.
Exactly. And that's the journey we're going on today, back into those insights.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning with Strauss himself.
All right. So Strauss is born in 1899, Germany. Pretty traditional Jewish upbringing, orthodox, solid humanistic education.
Yeah, I can see that shaping his interests later on.
Totally. And get this, by 17, he's already deep into political Zionism. Then, University of Marburg, right in the thick of neo-Kantian thought.
Marburg, wasn't that like a major center for that kind of stuff?
Oh yeah, huge. And he ends up writing his dissertation under Ernst Cassirer, a student of Hermann Cohen. The topic, F.H. Jacobi.
Jacobi, I'm familiar. But remind me, what was the big deal with Jacobi?
Well, the dissertation was all about Jacobi and the problem of knowledge. Specifically, this tension between reason and revelation in Jacobi's work.
Reason versus revelation. That's a classic.
Right. And what's funny is later on, Strauss called this early work disgraceful.
Disgraceful, wow.
Yeah, but even though he distanced himself from it, that central tension, knowledge versus faith, reason versus revelation, it pops up over and over in his work.
It's like a recurring theme, huh?
Absolutely. For a philosopher like you, thinking about how these two worlds, philosophy and theology, how they bump up against each other.
Right.
Strauss's early struggle with this is really telling.
Definitely. So what happens after Marburg?
Well, he spends a year in Freiburg. Really important year, actually. He's influenced by Husserl, phenomenology.
Right.
But even more so by Heidegger.
Heidegger, yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. I mean, he later said Heidegger had a deeper impact on him than any other contemporary thinker.
Wow.
And then he gets a gig lecturing at the Freies Jüdisch Lehrhaus under Franz Rosenzweig.
Okay, another big name, Rosenzweig. Wasn't he a major figure in Jewish philosophy too?
Absolutely. And in 1930, Strauss publishes his first book, Spinoza's Critique of Religion, dedicated to Rosenzweig. And in it, he kind of takes on the common way people were reading Spinoza at the time.
How so?
Well, Strauss felt that they weren't taking Spinoza's engagement with divine revelation seriously enough. Like, they were downplaying this whole dimension of his thought.
Interesting. So he's already kind of pushing back against the mainstream interpretation, even then.
Totally. And then in 1932, he writes this review of Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political. It becomes super famous, sparks a lot of debate.
Schmitt, yeah, I remember that one. Schmitt was trying to, redefine politics, break away from liberalism, wasn't he?
Exactly. And Strauss, in his review, he argues that even though Schmitt's trying to move beyond liberalism, he's still stuck in it.
How so?
Because Strauss says Schmitt can't really justify his own commitment to the political. Like, where does that commitment come from? What are the grounds for it? And this is where it gets really interesting for you as a philosopher. See, Strauss is worried about this broader problem. How can liberalism, which says it's neutral on all these big questions of value, how can it actually justify its own value system, especially when faced with, radical skepticism and relativism?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Schmitt himself, he actually acknowledged how insightful Strauss's critique was. Really shows how deeply Strauss understood him.
Yeah, he must have been onto something. So what's next for Strauss? Where does he go from there?
Well, things get tough financially, but then he gets this Rockefeller Foundation fellowship, takes him to France and England. He starts working on Hobbes.
Hobbes, yeah, the Leviathan guy.
Exactly. And remember, this is all happening as Hitler is rising to power.
Right, right.
So Hobbes, who Strauss saw as a key figure in the development of the liberal state, becomes really relevant, especially as the Weimar Republic is collapsing.
They're kind of coming together, huh?
Totally. So in 1936, he publishes The Political Philosophy of Hobbes. And in this book, he links his interest in the relationship between philosophy and politics to his earlier work on Spinoza and religion.
So he's connecting the dots, saying there's this deep link between liberalism and how it approaches religious belief.
Exactly. But here's the twist. At the same time, he's also working on something completely different. In 1935, he publishes Philosophy and L'Art, contributions to the understanding of Maimonides and his predecessors.
Maimonides?
Yeah, and for you, thinking about medieval philosophy, this is a big turning point. This is where he really starts digging into pre-modern thought.
Okay, so what's he saying about Maimonides?
Well, he's taking on Julius Guttmann, another scholar who is focused on the relationship between reason and revelation in medieval Jewish thought.
Okay.
Guttmann was all about epistemology, how we know what we know. But Strauss, he says, hold on, Maimonides wasn't just worried about knowledge. He was also concerned with the political and legal context.
So how philosophy works within a system of divine law.
Exactly. Strauss argues that for Maimonides, philosophy can clarify the law, but it can't be the source of its authority. That comes from God.
Interesting. So for someone like me, thinking about reason versus revelation.
Yeah.
Strauss is saying that for Maimonides, the big question wasn't just, like, are these different types of knowledge compatible?
Right.
But how does a society actually function under a divinely ordained legal system?
Exactly.
That's a subtle but important distinction.
Absolutely. And it's around this time that Strauss starts to seriously think, hey, maybe there's something in this pre-modern stuff that modern philosophy is missing.
Like maybe we need to go back to the source, so to speak.
Yeah, and then, big change. He immigrates to the U.S., ends up at Columbia and the New School for Social Research. Super productive period.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He starts publishing all these important essays that eventually become Persecution and the Art of Writing in 1952.
Persecution and the Art of Writing. Now, that's a classic. What's the main idea there?
Well, this is where he introduces his famous concept of exoteric writing.
Exoteric writing, yeah, I've heard that term. But what does it actually mean?
Okay, so imagine you're a philosopher back in the day living under some oppressive regime, right?
Right.
You have these radical, maybe even dangerous ideas.
Yeah.
So what do? You can't just shout them from the rooftops.
Right, you get in trouble.
Exactly. So Strauss says these thinkers would hide their true message within their texts.
Like a secret code?
Kind of. It's called esoteric writing. On the surface, the text says one thing, but beneath that, there's a deeper, hidden teaching.
Fascinating. So who was writing like this, according to Strauss?
He pointed to Maimonides, Halevi, Spinoza, all these big names.
Really?
Yeah, and for you, thinking about the history of philosophy and all the challenges philosophers have faced, this idea of strategic communication, it raises all these questions about truth, power, and how we even write about philosophy itself.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's like, can you really be honest about what you think if your life depends on it?
Heavy stuff.
Oh.
So what else was Strauss working on during this time?
Well, at the New School in 1948, he publishes On Tyranny, an interpretation of Xenophon's Harrow.
Okay. And what's this one about?
He's exploring this tension between the philosopher's pursuit of truth and the demands of politics.
Yeah, that's a classic dilemma, isn't it?
Right. Like, can you be a philosopher and a ruler at the same time?
Right.
He even questions the whole idea of the philosopher king.
The philosopher king. You mean like Plato's ideal?
Yeah, that one. Strauss is saying maybe it's not so simple. Maybe there's an inherent conflict there.
Interesting. So what happens next for Strauss?
Well, in 1949, he moves to the University of Chicago, stays there until he retires. Really influential period, teaches tons of students.
Yeah, Chicago was like his home base, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And his lectures there, they become the basis for his book, Natural Right in History, published in 1953.
Natural Right in History, okay. And what's the focus there?
He's looking at moral relativism in the social sciences, and he's comparing ancient and modern conceptions of natural right.
So, like, are there universal moral principles, or is it all just relative to your culture and time period?
Exactly that question.
Big one.
Yeah, and he keeps writing Thoughts on Machiavelli comes later, and then there's the argument and action of Plato's Laws published after his death.
Wow, so he's really engaging with all the heavy hitters of Western philosophy.
He is, and he's always trying to get at these fundamental questions about, like, what does it mean to be human? What's the good life?
Right. Okay, so let's dig into some of his core ideas. One that really stands out is this idea of the theologico-political predicament of modernity.
Theologico-political predicament, yeah.
Now, for a philosopher like you, thinking about the role of faith and reason, especially in the public sphere, what did Strauss actually mean by that?
Okay, so this is a big one. It's at the heart of his critique of modern thought. The theologico-political predicament basically means this. When we try to separate theology and politics, like people started doing in the early modern period, it creates all sorts of problems, unexpected consequences.
Okay, so what's the problem?
Well, first off, it's really important to understand that Strauss was not saying we should go back to theocracy.
Right.
Or any kind of political theology.
No, of course not.
His point was much more subtle, more challenging, I think.
So what was he saying?
He wanted to recover what the classical political philosophers understood about human society. They knew there were always going to be tensions, contradictions. You can't just reason them away.
Right.
And so he argued a healthy society, a healthy intellectual life, requires acknowledging those tensions, negotiating them carefully. It's about finding a kind of moderation in philosophy, theology, and politics. And he felt like that moderation was missing in the modern world.
So he wasn't saying, like, let's go back to the Middle Ages.
No, not at all. It was more like, let's learn from how the pre-modern thinkers dealt with these issues, because they were dealing with the same human problems we still face today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sure.
And a big part of that, it seems, was their understanding of the relationship between revelation and philosophy.
Absolutely. That's key for Strauss.
And for any philosopher, right. It's like this ongoing tension.
It is. And Strauss, he really critiques this modern tendency, which started in the 17th century, to judge revelation by the same standards as science or philosophy.
Like it has to be empirically verifiable or logically provable.
Exactly. And he says, if you do that, you're basically shutting down any real engagement with revelation on its own terms.
Right.
You're either dismissing it outright or you're trying to force it into some rationalistic framework.
So he's saying there's a fundamental difference between these two ways of understanding the world.
Yeah. For Strauss, revelation and philosophy, or as he often put it, Jerusalem and Athens, the Bible and Greek philosophy. Right.
They represent fundamentally different approaches and ultimately irreconcilable ones.
Irreconcilable. Wow, that's a pretty bold claim, especially for a philosopher. What was his reasoning behind that?
Well, his argument was that belief in revelation isn't about having self-evident knowledge.
Yeah.
You can't just prove it with reason.
Okay.
And so philosophy, which is all about reason and evidence, can't definitively say whether revelation is true or false.
I see.
He even said this really interesting thing. He said, the genuine refutation of orthodoxy would require the proof that the world and human life are perfectly intelligible without the assumption of a mysterious God.
Wow.
It would require at least the success of the philosophical system. Man has to show himself theoretically and practically as the master of the world and the master of his life. The merely given must be replaced by the world created by man, theoretically and practically.
Okay, so he's setting a high bar there.
He is. And his point is, no one's actually met that bar. No philosophical system has explained everything, made us masters of the universe.
Right. So the possibility of revelation, it stays open. It's a distinct way of understanding things.
So what you're saying is, the Enlightenment, with its focus on reason, maybe it didn't completely triumph over religion like we often think.
Exactly. And for you, thinking about the role of faith in the public sphere,
right,
that's a crucial point.
It is. And how did Strauss see this playing out in the history of modern thought?
Well, he argued that the Enlightenment's critique of religion, it actually ended up undermining modern rationalism itself.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it wasn't that he was against modern science.
Okay.
But he was against this idea that scientific knowledge is the only real knowledge.
Right. Like if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking, it devalues all the other ways of understanding the world, the pre-scientific, the pre-philosophical.
I see.
So he sees this trajectory in modern philosophy. It starts with this huge confidence in reason, thinking it can explain everything. But then it kind of collapses in on itself, ends up in this radical historicism. where all truth is just relative to your time and place.
Oh, okay, so it's like a pendulum swing.
Yeah, exactly. Think about Hobbes and Spinoza in the 17th century. They wanted to replace everything with a scientific worldview.
Okay.
But then you get to someone like Heidegger in the 20th century. And for Strauss, Heidegger is saying, even science is just another historical phenomenon. It's not really getting at any objective truth.
That's a pretty bleak view.
It is. And Strauss sees Heidegger not as a break from modern rationalism, but as its logical endpoint. It's what happens when you push that initial premise too far.
So where does this leave us? What's the connection to, like, the political disasters of the 20th century?
This is where it gets really unsettling. Strauss argues that just as philosophy went from this overconfidence in reason to a kind of nihilism, political philosophy followed a similar path. It started by trying to ground everything in a scientific understanding of nature, but then it ended up denying any fixed human nature at all. And for Strauss, the real test of this was National Socialism.
The rise of Nazism.
Yeah, he argued that modern philosophy and theology, they couldn't offer a coherent response to that.
Like they didn't have the intellectual or moral resources to fight it.
Exactly. And that's why he thought going back to modern philosophy was so important. Because those thinkers, they still had a strong sense of right and wrong, good and bad. Maybe we need to rediscover that.
That's a pretty powerful argument.
It is. And it leads us to another really interesting and controversial aspect of Strauss's thought, this idea of esotericism and the art of writing.
Esoteric writing, yeah. So how does this fit into his critique of modernity and this whole theological political predicament we've been talking about?
It's all connected. Remember, Strauss was really interested in how these pre-modern thinkers dealt with dangerous ideas.
Right, especially when they were living under oppressive regimes.
Exactly. And he argued that some of them, they wrote in this veiled way, this esoteric way. It wasn't just about hiding from persecution. It was also about being responsible with their ideas.
I see.
Like they knew that some truths, if you just throw them out there, it could cause chaos.
Right.
So they wrote in a way that only certain readers, the ones who were ready for it, could really understand.
So for Strauss, interpreting these texts, it's not just an academic exercise. It's almost like a moral duty.
Absolutely. You have to approach these thinkers with respect, with a sense of responsibility. And he even talked about the pangs of conscience that an interpreter should feel when trying to uncover these hidden teachings.
Wow. Pangs of conscience.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. So why would someone like Maimonides, for example, choose to write in this veiled manner? What was his motivation? Well, take Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. He wrote it as a letter to his student, Joseph, who was living in the diaspora.
Okay, so he's writing to someone who's already kind of outside the mainstream.
Exactly. And Strauss argues that this situation, the pressures of maintaining Jewish identity and practice in a non-Jewish environment, it created a real need for this kind of writing.
Like you can't just spell everything out. It could be dangerous.
Exactly. And Strauss believed that only a really profound nationwide concern, the necessity of saving the law, could have justified Maimonides seemingly breaking this traditional rule against making esoteric knowledge public.
Okay, so for Strauss, uncovering these hidden teachings, it wasn't just about like decoding a puzzle.
No.
It was about recovering a lost way of thinking, a way of approaching the big questions about philosophy, theology, and politics.
Exactly. And for you, thinking about how we interpret historical texts, it adds this whole other layer of complexity and urgency.
Absolutely. And Maimonides is a good example of this, right? Yeah. Because Strauss really changed his view on how to read him.
He did. You see, earlier on, even Strauss himself, he read Maimonides in this mainly epistemological way.
Like it was all about how we know things.
Right. But later, he argues that Maimonides saw Moses, the lawgiver, as a kind of philosopher king, like Plato's ideal. And this emphasis on Moses' political role as the founder of the law, it becomes central to Maimonides' political philosophy. For Maimonides, the important thing about the Torah wasn't so much where it came from, but what it did.
Like its practical purpose in the world.
Exactly. It's about understanding the law so you can obey it. And that's what leads to a flourishing political community.
So it's not just about abstract knowledge. It's about how you live your life, how you order society.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting idea. Strauss argues that Maimonides had this dual understanding of the law, and that reflects in his writing, too.
Dual understanding. Okay, so for a philosopher like me, thinking about theory and practice.
Yeah, this is key.
How does this work?
Okay, so Strauss says that Maimonides presents this exoteric, literal meaning of the law. That's for the general public.
Okay, so the rules, the basic stuff.
Right. It's about maintaining social order, but then there's also this esoteric meaning.
Id meaning.
Yeah, the philosophical meaning, and only certain people can access that.
The ones who are ready for it.
Exactly. The ones who can handle the deeper, more radical ideas.
Interesting.
And Strauss sees this as a deliberate strategy. It's about maintaining this tension between praxis, obeying the law,
Right.
and theoria, understanding the law on a philosophical level.
So it's not about resolving that tension, it's about holding it.
Exactly. He even says that Maimonides was looking for a golden mean, which is neither a compromise nor a synthesis, but something that suppresses them both, uproots them by a prior, more profound question, by raising a fundamental problem, the work of a truly critical philosophy.
Okay, so what is that fundamental problem?
It's the question of reason itself and the tension between philosophical theory and practical life.
Yeah, that's a big one. And especially for someone thinking about how reason shapes human affairs.
Absolutely. Strauss believed that the modern obsession with reason, this idea that it can solve everything,
Right.
it ironically leads to reason's own limits.
And we talked about with historicism.
Exactly. And so esotericism becomes a way of preserving both philosophy and revelation.
Okay.
The law has its limits. It can't explain everything rationally. And philosophy, it needs the moral and social order that the law provides.
I see.
So by trying to understand Maimonides' art of writing, Strauss is actually trying to protect both genuine philosophical inquiry and religious life.
It's like he's saying you need both.
Yeah, in a way. And this all ties into another one of his big ideas, this quarrel between the ancients and the moderns.
The ancients and the moderns, yeah. How does esotericism fit into that?
Okay, so for Strauss, this wasn't just a historical debate.
Okay.
It was about a fundamental difference in how the ancients and the moderns understood reason. He saw the moderns as having this overconfidence in reason. They thought they had superseded everything that came before, especially revelation.
Right.
But ironically, that overconfidence leads to historicism, where everything becomes relative.
Yeah, we talked about that.
And Strauss contrasts this with the ancients, and especially Socrates.
Socrates, the I know that I know nothing guy.
Exactly. He's like the model of philosophical humility.
Yeah, I like that.
And Strauss points out how Socrates understood that even people's opinions, even when they're wrong, they can contain truth.
Interesting.
They're like clues to what's real.
Okay.
And for the ancients, philosophy wasn't about building a perfect system or finding all the answers.
Right.
It was about this ongoing quest for truth, driven by eros, by desire.
Yeah, it's like a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And they knew that the problems are always more evident than the solutions. So without a complete understanding of the universe, finding the right way to live, it's always going to be uncertain.
Yeah, that's a pretty humbling thought, especially compared to the moderns with their big systems.
Totally. So given all that, how does Strauss see the relationship between philosophy and revelation, especially when you consider that philosophy can't really prove or disprove it?
Right. So without this complete metaphysical understanding, this absolute certainty about the nature of reality, philosophy can't say for sure that revelation is wrong.
Okay.
And that's a problem for philosophy because it means that the philosophical life, the life dedicated to reason,
right,
it might not be the only right way to live.
Wow.
Strauss even said this really provocative thing in Natural Right and History. He said, philosophy has to grant that revelation is possible.
Okay.
But to grant that revelation is possible means to grant that the philosophic life is not necessarily, not evidently, the right life.
That's a big deal. Like, he's saying that maybe there's something beyond reason.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe the life of faith, the life that embraces something bigger than ourselves, maybe that's a valid way to live too.
So philosophy, with all its emphasis on reason, it can't really exclude that possibility. It can't. And in a way, that's a kind of refutation of philosophy by revelation.
That's a really interesting idea. Like, revelation sets a limit on what philosophy can claim.
Exactly. And this is where Strauss connects with some contemporary thinkers.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, guys like Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff, they're Christian philosophers, but they've also critiqued the Enlightenment's narrow view of knowledge.
Okay.
They point out that we accept all sorts of things without having absolute proof, like our senses, the existence of other minds, even basic moral intuitions.
Right. We don't demand scientific evidence for everything.
Exactly. So they're kind of challenging this idea that only certain types of knowledge are valid.
And Strauss is doing something similar, you're saying?
He is. He's saying once you acknowledge the limits of reason, the fact that you can't scientifically prove revelation, it doesn't mean it's meaningless or irrational.
Right. It could still be a source of truth.
Exactly. But it's really important to remember, Strauss wasn't trying to argue for revelation. His main goal was philosophical. He wanted to explore this tension, this challenge that revelation poses to philosophy.
So it's like a thought experiment almost.
Yeah, in a way. Some scholars, like Heinrich Meyer, they even argue that Strauss might have intentionally exaggerated this tension.
Really? Why would he do that?
To provoke philosophers, to make them question their own assumptions.
Interesting.
So there's this ongoing debate about whether Strauss actually believed in revelation himself, or whether it was just a tool for him, philosophically speaking.
Okay, that makes sense. And speaking of different views on revelation, Strauss himself was pretty critical of how Christianity understood it, wasn't he?
He was. He argued that the Christian focus on doctrine, on believing certain propositions, it actually contributed to the problems of modern rationalism.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, he saw modern philosophy as being closer to medieval Christian philosophy than to ancient Greek thought.
Okay.
Because both were trying to systematize revealed truth using reason.
I see.
So when modern thinkers attacked religion, they were often attacking this specific doctrinal understanding of revelation.
Not the kind of revelation you find in Judaism or Islam.
Exactly. And he saw a big difference between those traditions. In Judaism and Islam, the focus is on law, on how you live your life.
Okay.
And that created less conflict with philosophy. Philosophy was more free in a way because it wasn't stepping on religion's toes so much.
That's a really interesting point. So for Strauss, the biggest challenge that revelation posed to philosophy, it wasn't about knowledge about who had the right answers. It was about morality, about good and evil.
Exactly. And he drew a lot on Judah Halevi to make this point.
Halevi, And how did Strauss read him?
Well, he was really interested in Halevi's concept of the law of reason.
Okay.
And what Strauss realized was that what philosophers called natural law, it often boiled down to the bare minimum you need for any society to function, even a band of robbers.
A band of robbers.
Yeah. Halevi uses this example. He says, look, the Bible prohibits murder absolutely. It's wrong to kill anyone.
Okay.
But a gang of robbers, they only need to prohibit murder within the gang to keep things running smoothly.
I see.
So Strauss is saying this shows